Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 16th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be asking ourselves just how bad is the Russian political infighting gotten, and does it even matter that the Russian forces are still trying to go on the offensive? Let's get into it. Okay, so first off, we take a look at the tactical map, and what we can see is there's actually been some marginal Russian gains. I mean, they're very small, almost equivalent to a repositioning. But as we discussed, this itself is even potentially a tactically advantageous activity. Right? You can see Kalivska is now listed as occupied by Russian forces. This is a small urban development, right? But these sort of urban areas can be really strongly defended, especially if the defenders are able to dig in and fortify some of the positions. It can really become a bellwether, even just a small grouping of buildings, right? We can also see that there's been some movement down here. Russian forces have evened out this salient, taking the small village of Ploshchanka. And again, I mean, this seems so small that it doesn't seem like much more than maybe a rail station. But also important, again, because as we discussed, being able to secure this roadway here and move traffic up and down the roadway really is going to enable key defensive positions to be reinforced, right? And further to the south, you can see there's also been some level of Russian advance and actually a very small Ukrainian withdrawal, literally just withdrawing to the other side of the street here. It doesn't look like this is any particular village or area that they've taken, but we can see that it looks like there is some woodlands here. And as we've seen in other spots of fighting, dense woods are very significant in this conflict, right? Because they provide overhead concealment, right? Anyone operating in these wood lines is going to have a very hard time. It's also hard to drop those individually operated drones onto trees, dense trees and wood lines, simply because they will interfere with the munitions ability to drop directly onto its target. So I suspect that's why Russian forces have advanced, tried to take this chunk of wood line here simply because of its tremendous defensive advantages. And we've seen the Ukrainians do the same thing in almost all the videos you can watch. They will build their small defensive positions in even very small groves of trees and woodlines, just because it reduces the chances that you'll be observed. When we look to the south, this is the only other place that we've seen some updates on the tactical map. This is, of course, near the airport, which was is now listed as fully in Russian control as of yesterday, or whatever's left of the airport. But it does mean that Russians may be working to get that airport operational now that it is officially behind Russian lines. You can see there's just some small adjustments here. This sort of looks more like a refinement of where exactly Russian forces are known to be. But again, it looks like they are trying. It looks like almost they received directions to control up to this H20, but no further, because there's places where it appears they could have definitely advanced these intersections, but they haven't. So it looks like they're trying to just hold major intersections, maybe just to stop Ukrainian forces from being able to use H20 fully, but not necessarily occupying and controlling the road themselves. It's called denial, is the military term for it, when you don't seize an objective yourself, but you take actions to deny the enemy use of it. And so it looks like that's probably what they were ordered to do here, some sort of denial. Now, when we look deep back into it, first off, we actually should talk about, if we're going to talk about the chaos in the Russian backfield space, we really need to talk about the breaking story at the Russian military range. This is a shooting that reports that 2 volunteer soldiers on Saturday fired at troops at a Russian military range near Ukraine killing 11 and wounding 15 before being killed themselves. This is interesting because there's a couple of possible interpretations. The first is that, so it said the 2 volunteers from an unnamed ex-Soviet nation. So first interpretation is simple, that these were Russian draftees that were so dissatisfied, or perhaps so mentally ill, improperly screened, that they engaged on a revenge-driven shooting spree. That's certainly possible. Another interpretation is that this is actually a red on blue attack, right? This is actually Ukrainian forces who disguise themselves as Russian nationals. This is possible. I think somewhat less likely, but I will say in Afghanistan, this was routine. Taliban or Taliban sympathetic Afghans would actually join the Afghan National Police, the Afghan Army, and then they would, at an opportune moment, launch an attack on the partnered American forces. And they would often do so in places that American forces were vulnerable. A good example would be at a joint operating base. They might attack American forces in a dining facility, right? They don't have their armor. Their weapons are not loaded, ready to engage targets. So that's really and it was a tried and true tactic. It really, really was effective. Not so much at the militarily, right? The U.S. military was never in danger of having operations stop because of these attacks. But in order to mitigate the threat of these attacks, the partnership between the U.S. and Afghan forces took a tremendous hit. Now, and a good example would be that after one of these attacks, at least in my AO, we instituted a policy that said, hey, don't drop your armor unless the Afghans are somewhere where they've put down or turned in their weapons. And so that meant that, now we couldn't do a lot of the camaraderie building type activities, right? We couldn't share a meal together, right? And it was pretty off-putting because the Afghans would obviously be not in a combat posture, right? They would have no helmet, no body armor. They would just sort of have their weapon system right there next to them. But we would be sitting there looking like they were, full combat gear, plate carrier, helmet, rifle. It really made the collaboration and coordination piece of our partnership almost impossible. And so it's possible that this is being done to damage the ability of Russian Ministry of Defense troops to work with forces like the DNR and LNR, right? There's a reason they're probably not naming the nation. And that probably means that it's either a partner nation where the relationship really cannot afford to be soured. Again, I'm thinking the DNR and LNR, or it's possible it's Belarus, where we've seen, of course, a growing level of collaboration and staging. All of these things could be just about, all these things could be explanations. And I'll be curious, though we can't really trust much of what Russia says, I'll be curious to learn more as time goes on. Of course, when we look at the bigger picture, we zoom out a little bit, we see that the level of coordination in the Russian Ministry of Defense isn't much better. Institute for the Study of War has mentioned first that a rumor started going around among ultranationalist Russian mill bloggers that Russia was developing a hit list of mill bloggers who the MOD intends to prosecute for discrediting their handling of the war in Ukraine. As you guys know, mill bloggers are probably the most vocal pro-Putin segment. And so for them to feel that the government has turned on them and is now potentially their enemy, this represents probably Putin's last really rabid bastion of support. So for them to start to turn on him is really worrying for Putin. And they actually somehow contacted the originator of the rumor, who reported that there are no more lists and the issue of lists has been removed from the agenda. pretty sus if you ask me. What's even more interesting, we've talked about the fact that Prigozhin and Prigozhin has and his Wagner group have really been trying to show their superiority to the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now, as discussed on the battlefield, there's not a ton of evidence of that. Maybe you could argue that seizing that airport, but they still haven't been able to seize Bakhmut. It's not like their offensive is going any better than the Ministry of Defense, but that doesn't mean they can't jockey for position. And in an October 13th social media post, the Russian Ministry of Defense 126th Coastal Brigade in Kherson said they have been fighting the area since the beginning of the war with no breaks or troop rotation. And the servicemen said they're being, quote, crushed by Ukrainian forces and that they have one BTR for 80 people, which means basically they are not a mechanized unit at this point. They can't move all their people with one BTR. And then after that came out, Wagner Group transferred 4 off-road vehicles to the 126th Coastal Defense Battalion in support of their efforts to hold the front line in Kherson. This is, of course, humiliating for the Russian Ministry of Defense, who is chiefly responsible for providing logistic support to the entire combat effort. So the fact that they are failing and that Wagner Group is coming in and generously donating some additional vehicles is a sign of the fact that, Prigozhin is trying to really jockey for position as the superior fighting force in Ukraine. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you for today. If you want access to the uncensored combat video breakdowns, of course, please become a member of the Patreon. You know, YouTube has been pretty iffy on me as far as censoring videos, demonetizing them, age restricting them. And I'm on the road. I can't really display my lieutenant tier patrons, but you guys are make this possible. Thank you so much, and I'll see you guys in the next one.